3 days after the funeral of a quiet old man in Kenya, people found enormous elephant tracks leading straight to his freshly covered grave, with green branches laid carefully on the earth like part of a ritual. No one could understand why a wild elephant would come back to that place, but the truth was even more astonishing. Months earlier, that same man had risked his life to save a baby elephant from drowning in the mud on a night no one should have survived alone. And what happened after he died left everyone who witnessed it in tears, because they realized that gratitude is not always carried in memory alone. Sometimes it is passed on like a lesson from one heart to another. Walter Boone had spent 40 years repairing things that no one else had the patience to understand. Pocket watches with cracked crystal faces, mantel clocks that coughed instead of chimed, wristwatches inherited from fathers who had been dead longer than some men had been alive. In the little town outside Columbus, people trusted his hands because they moved slowly, and because slow hands rarely lied. His shop sat between a laundromat and a bakery that opened before dawn. Every morning, Walter unlocked the door at exactly 8:15, flipped the sign to open, and stood still for a moment in the hush before the ticking began. It was his favorite part of the day, that narrow strip of silence when nothing had been fixed yet and nothing had gone wrong. The walls were lined with clocks of every shape and era, each one measuring time in its own stubborn dialect. Some clicked with military precision. Some dragged their seconds like tired feet on a porch. Walter knew them all by sound. He could tell which spring was failing, which pendulum was drifting, which gear was one winter away from giving up for good. After Elaine died, the shop became quieter in a way clocks could not fill. She had been the kind of woman who talked to strangers in grocery lines and remembered the names of their dogs. She used to bring him lunch in wax paper, kiss his temple, and say the room smelled like brass, dust, and old promises. 2 years after her funeral, he still turned sometimes, expecting her voice. At home, the quiet had edges. Her blue mug still stood in the cabinet, though he never used it. Her garden clippers still hung by the back door, clean and waiting for hands that would never return. Even the recliner across from his felt occupied somehow, as if grief had weight and shape and preferred to sit where she once had, watching him fail at pretending he was fine. His daughter, Rachel, called every Sunday evening from Denver, always beginning in the same careful tone, as if she were stepping onto thin ice. She asked whether he was eating enough, whether he had seen anyone, whether he had thought about closing the shop for a while. Walter answered kindly, even warmly, but he always kept a corner of himself locked away where no one, not even Rachel, could reach. The truth was harder to say aloud than any diagnosis. He was not exactly falling apart. He was simply narrowing. His days had become so precise, so repeatable, that they no longer felt lived in. Wake up, open the shop, repair what was broken, heat soup, sit in the dark with the television on low, sleep, begin again. Even sorrow had become routine, which frightened him more than sorrow itself. One rainy afternoon in late October, while searching a hallway closet for an extension cord, Walter found Elaine's old travel journal tucked inside a canvas tote bag. A pressed leaf slipped from between the pages and landed at his feet. He almost put the journal back untouched, but then he saw her handwriting on the inside cover and felt something in his chest pull tight. Most of the journal was filled with short notes from road trips they had taken years ago, cheap diners in Pennsylvania, a motel in Tennessee with a broken ice machine and a view of the mountains. Then, near the back, he found a page written in a shakier hand, dated only 3 months before she died. It wasn't long. That made it worse. Elaine had always known how to be devastating in very few words. One line stopped him cold. One day, when the house feels too small for all this sadness, go somewhere wild enough to remind you that life still moves. Walter read it once, then again, and then a third time with his glasses off because the words had blurred. He sat on the hallway floor much longer than he meant to, the journal open in his lap like a door he had been afraid to touch. That evening, Rachel called and heard the difference before he said anything at all. His voice sounded thinner, less defended, as though some old seal had cracked. He read her the line from the journal, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Rachel began to cry softly, not from shock, but from relief. It was the first time in months her father sounded like a man standing near a decision. The idea should have felt ridiculous. 63-year-old widower with bad knees and a talent for repairing antique mechanisms did not suddenly book a trip to Africa. Men like Walter went to hardware stores, not faraway savannas. And yet, over the next week, he found himself staying up late reading about Kenya, about migration routes, about open grasslands and long horizons wide enough to humble grief. He told almost no one, not because he was ashamed, but because speaking it aloud might make it fragile. Still, the town noticed small signs. He sold 2 old wall clocks he had sworn he'd keep forever. He asked the pharmacist about motion sickness tablets. He brought in a suitcase from the basement and left it open on the guest bed for 3 days, as if waiting to see whether courage would really enter the room. On the last evening before his flight, Walter closed the shop later than usual and stood alone beneath the layered ticking he had lived with for half his life. He rested a hand on the workbench where Elaine used to set down his lunch and looked at the rows of patient clocks staring back at him. For the first time since losing her, he was not asking time to stop hurting. He was asking it to carry him somewhere. By the time Walter Boone reached the edge of Amboseli, the land had already begun to work on him in ways he did not yet understand. The sky felt larger than any sky he had ever known, stretched so wide and pale above the earth that it seemed to erase the habit of looking down. Even the silence was different here. It did not feel empty. It felt watchful. He had rented a dusty 4-wheel drive in Nairobi that rattled faintly at higher speeds and smelled like sun-baked vinyl. The young man at the counter had smiled when he saw Walter studying the paper map instead of relying on his phone. "Out there," he had said, tapping the road with one finger. "Signal comes and goes. Better trust the old ways." Walter had liked him immediately for that. The morning had started clean and bright. Acacia trees stood scattered across the plain like patient thoughts, and herds moved in the distance with a calm that made even the wild seem orderly. Walter drove slowly, one hand light on the wheel, the other resting near the pocket where Elaine's folded journal page rode with him. He had not read it again, but he carried it all the same. He was meant to stay on the marked route that curved toward a lodge where he planned to spend the night. That had been the agreement he made with Rachel over the phone before leaving the States. No heroics, no wandering, no trying to prove anything to anyone. Walter had promised. At 63, He knew the difference between adventure and foolishness, or at least he thought he did. The trouble started with the wind. It rose without warning sometime after noon, sliding over the grasslands in long, dusty sheets that blurred the road and turned the horizon into a shifting wall of gold. Walter slowed, squinting through the windshield as grit whispered against the glass. The path ahead split around a stand of thorn trees, and by the time he chose the left fork, the road signs were already gone behind him. At first, he told himself it was nothing. Roads returned to roads. Maps straightened themselves when panic stayed out of the way. But 20 minutes later, the track had narrowed into 2 shallow ruts through scrubland, and the ground beneath his tires felt softer than it should have. When the steering wheel pulled strangely to one side, Walter stopped the vehicle, stepped out, and found the rear tire sagging almost flat. The heat pressed down with a kind of personal insistence. Walter rolled up his sleeves, unloaded the jack, and crouched beside the wheel, feeling the ache in his knees almost immediately. He had changed tires before, but not under a sky this large, and not with the odd sense that the land had gone still around him. No birds, no engine noise, just wind moving through dry grass like something breathing in its sleep. That was when he heard it. Not a cry, exactly. Not the sharp distress sound of an animal in obvious pain. It was lower than that, rougher, as if something large were trying to pull air into exhausted lungs. Walter froze with one hand on the lug wrench and listened. The sound came again, thin but real, drifting from beyond a patch of brittle brush and a stretch of cracked mud the color of old clay. He should have stayed with the vehicle. Any sensible person would have. But Walter had spent too many years leaning toward broken things to ignore a sound like that. He set the wrench down, took a bottle of water from the passenger seat almost without thinking, and walked carefully toward the edge of the dry basin. The mud there was split into hard plates, except for one dark pocket where the ground had not finished letting go of the wet season. At first, he saw only movement. Then the shape resolved itself, and the breath left his body in one stunned rush. A young elephant, no more than a calf, was trapped deep in the mud, its front half twisted awkwardly as it fought to keep its head above the sinking weight below. One front leg was pinned at an unnatural angle, and around it, half hidden beneath the caked earth, a length of rusted wire bit cruelly into the skin. Walter stood motionless, the water bottle warm in his hand. The calf's ears flapped once, weakly, then fell still. Mud caked its sides in heavy layers, and its trunk lifted only a few inches before dropping again. There were deep drag marks nearby, chaotic and torn, and something else too. Tracks from more than one vehicle, older but not old enough for comfort. Walter did not need much imagination to understand the shape of what had happened here. The sight changed him in an instant. The long flight, the careful plans, the promise to Rachel, the lodge waiting somewhere beyond the haze, all of it seemed to fall away in the face of that trapped, heaving body. This was no longer a trip. It was no longer about grief or distance or whether he still had the nerve to travel alone. It had narrowed suddenly into one brutal, simple question. Leave or stay? Walter stepped closer to the edge, careful not to let the earth crumble beneath him. The calf turned one dark, exhausted eye toward him, and something about that look unsettled him more than panic would have. It was not wild rage. It was not even fear. It was the spent, bewildered look of a creature that had struggled too long and no longer understood why help had not come. He glanced back toward the stranded vehicle, small and lonely against the open land. The sun had already begun its slow slide westward. In another hour, the light would start to go. If he left now and managed to find help, maybe he could return in time. Maybe. But the mud was still pulling, and the calf's breathing had grown shallow enough that every pause between breaths felt like a warning. Walter knew, before he admitted it, that the animal might not last the night. Walter Boone had always believed that decisions revealed themselves in the body before they formed in the mind. His hands knew before his thoughts did. They knew when a spring was too worn to trust, when a hinge would fail under pressure, when a mechanism could still be saved if someone acted quickly enough. Standing at the edge of that mud basin, he felt the answer arrive the same way. He was not leaving. He went back to the vehicle with a speed that surprised him. The rear tire could wait. He pulled out 2 more bottles of water, a faded canvas tarp, a flashlight, a coil of rope, and the short-handled shovel he kept behind the seat. None of it looked like enough. It looked like the sort of poor equipment an old man carried when he preferred to be prepared for inconvenience, not catastrophe. When he returned, the calf had stopped struggling for the moment, though that did not comfort him. It was breathing in shallow, uneven pulls, each one sounding scraped raw from inside. Walter crouched at a safer distance and unscrewed one of the bottles. "Easy now," he said, his voice softer than the wind. "I don't know what I'm doing either, so that makes 2 of us." The words were absurd, but the sound of them steadied him. He poured a little water into the cap, and then into the hollow of the tarp, dragging it closer with the shovel handle. The calf's trunk twitched, sniffed weakly, then stretched toward the scent with desperate effort. It could barely reach. Walter lay flat on the cracked earth, heart pounding harder than it had any right to, and nudged the tarp another inch forward. This time, the trunk found the water. The change was small, but he saw it. Not strength exactly, more like recognition. The calf drew in the water in clumsy, trembling pulls, as if remembering that life still had a taste worth fighting for. Walter gave it only a little at a time. Too much too fast felt dangerous, though he could not have said where that instinct came from. He trusted it anyway. Years at a workbench had taught him that panic ruined more things than patience ever did. He moved to the trapped leg next, and his stomach tightened when he saw the wire clearly. It had once been part of a snare, maybe for something smaller, but the calf had stumbled into it during its struggle and driven it deeper with every panicked movement. The skin around it was angry and swollen, slick in places beneath the caked mud. Walter did not touch it yet. First, he needed the animal calm. First, he needed the ground to stop claiming it. So he began to dig. Not dramatically, not with the strength of a rescuer in a movie, but the stubborn, practical digging of a man too old to perform and too decent to quit. He worked around the calf's flank, clearing away the drying edge where mud had hardened into suction. Every few minutes, he stopped to offer more water. Every few minutes, he spoke again, low and steady, so the animal would hear a voice instead of only pain. Time changed shape under that sky. The sun slid lower. Sweat ran down Walter's back and dried there in the wind. His knees ached, then numbed, then ached again. Twice the calf thrashed suddenly, and both times he had to scramble backward fast enough to send a crack of fear through his chest. But the struggling grew weaker with each burst, which frightened him more than the violence did. Weakness had a silence to it he recognized too well. By the time the light began to soften, the first sound of hyenas drifted from somewhere far off and then farther in. Walter straightened slowly, one hand pressed to the small of his back, and looked around at the open land with a new kind of awareness. He was no longer simply stranded. He was committed. Night was coming, and if no one came before it, he would be spending the dark beside a half-buried elephant calf with a flat tire behind him and predators testing the edges of the dusk. He tried his phone again, climbing onto a rise of harder ground and lifting it uselessly toward the sky. One bar flickered and vanished. He cursed once under his breath, not because he was angry, but because the sound gave shape to his fear. When he looked back down, the calf had lifted its head a little, as though tracking him. It was a terrible and tender thing to be watched by something that had already placed its chances in your hands. He had just returned to the basin when he heard another engine, faint and uneven, buzzing somewhere beyond the scrub. Walter turned so sharply he almost lost his footing. A small motorcycle came into view between the thorn trees, kicking up dust, ridden by a young Maasai man in a faded red shuka and work boots. The rider slowed at once when he saw the vehicle, then stopped dead when he spotted the calf. For a moment, neither man spoke. Then the young rider killed the engine, swung off the bike, and took in the scene with one sweeping glance that missed nothing. The mud, the wire, the bottles, the oldie American with dirt up both sleeves. "You stayed," he said at last, his English clear and lightly accented. Walter let out a breath that almost sounded like a laugh. "Looks like I did." The young man nodded once, serious now. "My name is Noah. We need to move fast." Noah crouched near the edge and studied the trapped leg with the calm of someone raised close to danger. He explained that he worked nights with a community ranger team about 5 miles away and had taken this track as a shortcut after checking a water point. He pointed to the old tire marks and said what Walter had already feared. Poachers had probably pushed a herd through the area days earlier. In the confusion, the calf may have fallen behind and gotten trapped. With 2 people, the impossible shifted slightly closer to difficult. Noah cut branches to spread their weight near the softer ground. Walter held the flashlight while Noah tested where they could step without sinking. Together, they widened the cleared space around the calf's body, moving in short bursts whenever it lay still, retreating when its panic rose again. The work was clumsy and exhausting, but now there was rhythm to it. Dig, soothe, water, wait, begin again. As darkness gathered at the edges of the basin, Noah used a small knife to work carefully at the embedded wire, while Walter kept one hand on the tarp and kept talking, as if words themselves were another kind of rope. The calf let out one ragged cry that tore through the evening and then sagged with exhaustion. When the wire finally came free, Walter felt a sharp rush of relief so sudden it almost dropped him to his knees. It was not enough to free the leg. The mud still held the rest of the calf like a fist. Noah studied the rope, the tarp, and the angle of the nearest acacia trunk, then began laying out a desperate plan in quick, practical phrases. Walter listened, nodded, and did not mention how tired he was, or how the cold of evening had begun to creep into his hands. Overhead, the first stars were appearing. Somewhere in the dark, the hyenas called again, closer now. By full dark, the basin had turned into a world of narrow light and moving shadows. Walter held the flashlight low, while Noah looped the rope beneath the calf's chest as best he could, working knee-deep in mud with a focus that made him seem older than he was. The beam shook in Walter's hand, not only from fatigue, but from the growing awareness that if this failed, there might not be another try. The calf had almost stopped fighting. That frightened Walter more than any violent thrashing could have. Its breaths came slow and uneven now, each one followed by a pause just long enough to make him lean forward and wait for the next. "Stay with us," he kept saying, though he knew the animal could not understand the words. Some part of him believed tone mattered. Some part of him believed presence did too. Noah anchored the rope around the acacia, trunk, and tested the tension with both hands. The plan was crude, but it was all they had. Walter would help pull from firmer ground, while Noah guided the calf's body free inch by inch, keeping its wounded leg from twisting deeper. Neither man said out loud what both of them understood. If the calf panicked at the wrong moment, the rope could slip, the mud could take it again, or one of them could get hurt badly enough to end the rescue for good. When they pulled the first time, nothing happened. The rope tightened. The trunk groaned softly. Mud sucked and held. Walter felt the strain all the way into his shoulders and jaw, the kind of force that reminded him he was no longer a young man trying to prove anything. He was an old man, with aching knees and a chest that had begun to flutter in unpleasant little beats. Still, he reset his feet and pulled again. The second pull brought movement. So slight at first, Walter thought he had imagined it. Then the calf let out a broken cry and lurched forward half an inch, enough to tear a wet sound from the basin floor. Noah shouted for him to keep steady, not harder. That was the kind of instruction Walter understood. Too much force shattered gears. Too much panic stripped threads. The difference between saving something and destroying it often came down to pressure. They worked that way for what felt like hours, though time had gone strange again. Pull, rest, water, dig, soothe, pull. The flashlight beam weakened, then steadied after Walter slapped the side with his palm. Mud coated their arms to the elbow. Twice Noah nearly lost his footing, and once Walter slipped backward so sharply the rope burned through his palms before he caught himself. Each small gain felt impossible, and each pause felt dangerous. At one point, the calf collapsed so completely that Walter thought it had died. Its trunk lay motionless on the mud, and even Noah stopped moving. The night around them seemed to close in. Walter dropped to one knee, near the edge, and spoke before he could think better of it, his voice cracking with something far more personal than fear. "You don't get to quit," he said softly. "Not tonight. I know that feeling. You still don't get to quit." Maybe it was coincidence. Maybe the calf had only been gathering what little strength remained. But after a few long seconds, its trunk twitched, then lifted weakly, searching. Walter reached forward with the tarp and let it find the shallow pool of water there. Relief passed between the two men without either of them naming it. Noah wiped sweat and mud from his brow with the back of his wrist. "Again," he said. Walter nodded. "Again." Near dawn, the mud began to surrender. Not all at once, not dramatically, but with the stubborn reluctance of something finally losing its grip. The calf's chest came free first, then one shoulder, then the trapped hindquarters with a sound like wet earth tearing open. Noah shouted for Walter to keep, pulling while he lifted at the wounded leg. Walter leaned back with everything he had left, and then suddenly the weight shifted. The calf slid forward onto firmer ground and lay there in a heaving heap, caked in mud and trembling from head to tail. For one breathless moment, neither man moved. Walter stood bent over the rope, unable to straighten, his whole body ringing with exhaustion. Noah dropped beside the calf at once, checking its breathing, its eyes, the leg where the wire had cut deepest. "Alive," he said after a moment, almost in disbelief. "She's alive." Walter had not realized until then that he had been praying in the shapeless, wordless way people do when they no longer know if they believe in anything at all. He sank down onto the hard ground, chest rising and falling too fast, and watched the calf lift its head. Its ears moved once. Its trunk dragged through the dirt and brushed against the tarp near his boot. It was not affection. It was only contact. But it hit him with the force of a human hand. Then the sound came. It rolled across the pale edge of morning so low, at first Walter felt it before he heard it. A deep vibration under the ground and in the air at once. Noah's head snapped up. Every trace of relief vanished from his face. He rose in one motion and turned toward the ridge beyond the thorn trees, where the first gray light was gathering over the scrub. "Walter," he said quietly, urgently, "step back. Now." A shape emerged out of the mist, enormous and deliberate. Then another step, and another, until the animal was fully visible on the rise. She was massive, taller than Walter had imagined anything living could be at that distance. Her silhouette cut against the dawn like something carved out of the earth itself. Her ears were spread wide. Her trunk was lifted. And even from where he stood, Walter could feel the force of her attention lock onto the scene below. The calf made a sound Walter had not yet heard from her, small and rough and full of recognition. She tried to stand, stumbled, then pushed herself up again, leaning hard on the uninjured leg. Noah muttered something under his breath in Ma. Not a curse exactly, more like a warning meant for both men and Sky. "Mother," he said, never taking his eyes off the ridge. "She has found us." Walter should have backed away. He knew that. Every sensible instinct still left in him told him to retreat toward the vehicle, to put metal and distance between himself and a mother elephant seeing her injured calf beside two strangers. But the calf, shaking where she stood, turned not toward the open land first, but toward him. Her trunk reached weakly in his direction, as if trying to hold on to the last solid thing she knew before the world changed again. The mother elephant did not charge. That was the first surprise. The second was somehow worse. She came down the rise with a speed so controlled, so deliberate, that it felt less like hesitation and more like judgment. Noah moved one step in front of Walter without even seeming to think about it. One hand lifted low, as if he could hold back catastrophe by keeping his own fear from spilling into the air. The calf let out another strained sound and tried again to move toward her mother. This time, she made it only 2 steps before her injured leg buckled. Walter flinched, instinct overriding caution, and reached out to steady her shoulder. The motion was small, but under that widening dawn, it felt enormous. Noah shot him a look of disbelief. The mother elephant saw it too. Her head lifted higher. Her trunk tested the air. She stopped 10 yards away, close enough now for Walter to see the mud drying in dark plates along her forelegs and the pale crescent scars running across one ear. She was older than he had first thought, immense without heaviness, every inch of her body carrying authority. Nothing in Walter's life had prepared him for the feeling of being so completely seen by another living creature. For a long second, the world narrowed to 3 breaths: the calf's ragged panting, Noah's careful, measured inhale beside him, and the low, deep rumble that began in the mother's chest and seemed to pass through the ground before it reached the air. The calf answered at once, weak but eager, and something shifted in the space between them. Not safety, not yet, but recognition. A thread had been found and pulled tight. The mother came closer, her attention fixed first on the calf. She touched the little one's face, neck, and shoulders with astonishing gentleness, tracing every line of mud, every tremor, every place where pain still lived. When her trunk reached the wounded leg, the calf shuddered. Walter saw the mother's body tense in response, saw her eyes flick toward the rusted wire lying in the dirt where Noah had dropped it. Then she turned to Walter. Everything in him went still. He did not decide to stop breathing. His body simply forgot how. The mother's trunk hovered inches from his shirt front, then moved slowly over the canvas tarp, the half-empty water bottles, the muddy rope, the shovel lying on its side. She was not glancing. She was investigating. Piece by piece, scent by scent, she seemed to be reconstructing the entire night from what remained on the ground. Walter became sharply aware of ridiculous details: the smear of mud on his sleeve, the ache in his right shoulder, the fact that Elaine's folded journal page was still tucked inside his front pocket. Noah murmured under his breath, perhaps to him, perhaps to God. But Walter did not move. Something deep and old in him understood that any sudden gesture now would be a kind of lie, and lies had no place in a moment like this. The trunk found his hands next. It passed over the cuts in his palms where the rope had burned him and the dried mud packed beneath his nails. The touch was shockingly precise, more delicate than anything that large had a right to be. Walter felt the warm breath coming through the tip of her trunk, felt it pause at the center of his chest, as though listening to a rhythm hidden under bone and fear. And then she did something Noah would later repeat to Lena 3 separate times, because once had not felt like enough. She touched him, not with force, not with warning. Just a brief, steady press of her trunk against the left side of Walter's chest, directly over his heart. The contact lasted no more than a second or two, but it carried a weight he would struggle to name for years afterward. It did not feel like a threat. It did not even feel like forgiveness. It felt like acknowledgement, solemn, searching, and somehow final. When she drew back, the calf leaned into her, and the mother answered with another low rumble that seemed to calm them both. She shifted her body then, angling herself between the rising sun and the smaller animal, as if shielding her from the day's first heat. Walter let out a breath, so unsteady it embarrassed him. Noah glanced at him once, eyes wide with the kind of fear that had not yet finished becoming wonder. "She knows," Noah said quietly. Walter kept his gaze on the mother elephant. "Knows what?" Noah did not answer right away. He watched as the mother nudged the calf gently, urging her to put weight where she could, to find balance, to try again. "That you stayed," he said at last. "That someone stayed." They waited while the calf gathered herself and rose more fully to her feet. She was still weak, still favoring the injured leg, but she was standing now, with her mother pressed close against her side. The sight of them together undid something in Walter that had been held tight for a very long time. He thought of hospital corridors, of unopened sympathy cards, of all the nights after Elaine died when the house had seemed too silent to survive. The mother elephant gave Walter one last look, and this time there was no alarm in it, no visible edge of violence waiting to be triggered. Then she turned away, guiding the calf with slow, patient pressure. The little one paused after a few steps and looked back. Walter could not have explained why, but he lifted one mud-streaked hand in the smallest of farewells. The calf's trunk twitched once in the air before she followed her mother into the thinning mist. For several moments after they disappeared, neither man spoke. The morning had fully arrived now, clear and gold at the edges, as if the land had decided not to mention what had just taken place. Noah finally bent to retrieve the rope and shook his head with a soft, disbelieving laugh. "No one will believe this exactly as it happened," he said. Walter looked down at the print the mother had left in the damp edge of the basin, vast and sharply outlined in the new light. His shirt was still warm where her trunk had rested over his heart. He pressed his hand there without thinking. Somewhere beyond the thorn trees, a low rumble drifted once across the plain, then faded. He did not know it yet, but he would cancel his flight that very afternoon. Walter Boone should have been on a flight home 3 days later. Instead, he was sitting on a metal chair outside a one-room field office, drinking tea that had gone lukewarm in the heat, while a woman named Dr. Lena Brooks read Noah's handwritten report with the expression of someone trying very hard not to indulge nonsense. The paper crackled softly in her hands. Walter found himself oddly more nervous under her silence than he had been under the gaze of the elephant. Lena was in her late 40s, sharp-eyed, sun-browned, and economical in the way she moved, as if she had spent too many years in the field, wasting neither motion nor words. Her khaki shirt was rolled neatly at the sleeves, and there was a pencil tucked behind one ear. She listened to Noah's account without interrupting, but every so often she glanced at Walter with the careful skepticism reserved for well-meaning visitors who returned from the bush with stories larger than their judgment. The community rescue station sat near the edge of a protected corridor where fenced farmland, ranger routes, and old migration paths pressed uneasily against one another. It was not the kind of place tourists usually saw. There were no polished signs, no gift shop, no curated wonder. Only 2 weather-beaten buildings, a water tank, a generator that coughed at sunset, and the constant feeling that every living thing nearby was negotiating with survival. Walter had come only to return the rope Noah had borrowed and to thank the people whose patrol routes had indirectly saved him from spending a second night stranded. That was the version of the day he had told himself in the mirror of the guest house. He would be polite. He would be practical. He would leave. But when Lena finally set down the report and asked him exactly where the calf had been trapped, he heard himself answering with the care of a man who did not want one important detail to be lost. He described the mud basin, the wire, the old tire marks, the mother's scars, the way the calf had reached for the tarp when she smelled water. Lena asked the kinds of questions that stripped drama out of memory and left only structure behind. How deep was the mud? Which leg was injured? How long between first sighting and extraction? Did the mother vocalize before she approached or after? Walter answered as precisely as he could. Precision was the one language he trusted. That seemed to matter to her. Not belief, not yet, but attention. By the end of the conversation, Lena's skepticism had shifted into something more measured. She explained that young elephants separated during poaching chases or fence breaks often did not survive long enough to be found again. She also said, with a directness Walter appreciated, that a mother returning without attacking was uncommon enough to be worth documenting carefully and not romanticizing. The distinction struck him as both fair and strangely kind. Noah, meanwhile, had already decided he liked Walter. He moved around him easily, translating fast Swahili exchanges with the cook, teasing him about his rented vehicle, asking questions about Ohio as if it were a country from old maps. In another life, Walter might have called the young man impulsive. Now, he simply found him bright. Noah had the quick instincts of someone raised close to risk, but there was gentleness underneath, especially when he spoke about animals or his younger sisters back home. Walter's original plan had been to spend one last day near the reserve boundary, then head back toward Nairobi. That afternoon, he called Rachel from a patch of weak signal near the water tank and told her there had been a change. He tried to make it sound modest. A short delay, a few more days, something worth seeing through. Rachel was quiet long enough that he thought the call had dropped. Then she said, very softly, "Dad, is this about the elephant?" He looked out across the dry grass and answered, "It's about more than that." He stayed first because Noah invited him to ride along on a morning patrol. Then, because Lena needed an extra pair of steady hands to log damaged fencing and check an old solar battery bank that had been failing for weeks. Then, because one of the wall clocks in the main office had stopped, and Walter fixed it almost absent-mindedly while waiting for coffee to boil. By evening, everyone at the station knew the older American who could coax dead mechanisms back into rhythm with a screwdriver and patience. There was something healing in being useful without being needed for conversation. Walter repaired a weather monitor that had been losing time, tightened a loose hinge on a feed shed door, and opened a radio handset whose static turned out to be caused by dust worked deep into a corroded contact. The staff began bringing him small broken things with embarrassed smiles, a flashlight switch, a binocular clasp, a kitchen timer. He took each object seriously. It had been a long time since seriousness felt like service instead of hiding. At night, from the narrow bed in the spare room Noah called the professor's quarters, Walter listened to the station settle around him. Generator hum, footsteps on gravel, distant barking from somewhere beyond the thorn fence. Once, much later, a low elephant rumble carried over the dark in a way that raised the hair on his arms. He lay still, staring at the corrugated roof above him, and thought of the brief pressure of a trunk over his heart. He could not explain why that memory felt less like danger than invitation. Lena kept her distance at first, though not unkindly. She had seen too many outsiders mistake emotion for understanding, and she was not willing to let one improbable encounter rewrite years of field knowledge. But she also noticed what Walter did not advertise. He never exaggerated when he retold what happened. He never called the animals his friends. He never tried to center himself in the story. He spoke about the rescue the way he spoke about clocks, with respect for complexity, and with an almost old-fashioned reluctance to claim more than he could prove. On the fourth day, Lena asked whether he would help Noah at a seasonal water point east of the corridor. It was routine work, she said. Bird counts, erosion notes, fence line observations, maybe signs of recent herd movement. Walter agreed too quickly for a man still pretending he would leave soon. Before dawn the next morning, he climbed into the station truck with a notebook, a canteen, and the folded page from Elaine's journal in his shirt pocket, though he could not have said why he wanted it there. The water point was little more than a shallow depression where moisture held longer than it should, ringed by hoofprints and the feathered tracks of birds. Walter stood beside Noah in the cool morning light, trying to learn how to read the ground the way younger men here seemed to read newspapers. Noah pointed out zebra sign, warthog crossings, and where a matriarch herd had likely passed at first light. Walter wrote each detail carefully, surprised by how hungry he felt to understand a world that moved without clocks. He was bent over the notebook, copying Noah's estimate of water depth, when the rumble reached them. It was faint, almost below hearing, but not below feeling. Noah stopped in the middle of a sentence. Walter looked up. Beyond a stand of fever trees, two shapes were moving through the pale gold morning, one immense, one smaller, still carrying the uneven gait of healing. The calf stepped into the open first. Then she saw him, stopped short, and lifted her trunk high into the air. For one suspended second, nothing moved except the calf's trunk testing the air. Then recognition seemed to pass through her whole body at once. She let out a small, breathy chirp, nothing like the broken sound she had made in the mud, and started forward with surprising speed. Noah grabbed Walter's sleeve on instinct, but the older man barely felt it. He was already staring at the uneven, eager way the young elephant closed the distance. The mother emerged a moment later, larger in full daylight than Walter remembered, her scarred ear catching the sun as she stepped clear of the fever trees. Noah's grip tightened, then slowly loosened when she did not accelerate, did not flare her ears, did not turn broadside in warning. She simply watched. The calf reached Walter first and stopped so abruptly she sent dust skidding around her feet, trunk stretching toward his shirt, his hands, the notebook at his side. Walter did not trust his own balance enough to move quickly. He stood very still and let the calf investigate him in a rush of warm breath and soft, damp touches. Her trunk nudged the canteen, then his elbow, then pressed into the front pocket where Elaine's folded journal page rested. Something like laughter broke out of Noah before he could stop it. "She remembers you," he said, half amazed, half delighted. Walter could only nod. The calf was stronger now, taller through the shoulder, though she still favored the injured leg just enough for the old pain to remain visible. A pale, healing ridge marked the place where the wire had cut her. When Walter's fingers hovered near it, she did not pull away. He did not touch the wound itself, only the air above it, as if acknowledging the scar were a form of courtesy. The mother took 2 measured steps closer and stopped again. Noah spoke softly, more to himself than to Walter. "We call her Nia," he said, eyes still fixed on the larger elephant. "It means purpose." Then he nodded toward the calf. "And Milo. Not a Maasai name. One of the boys at the station suggested it, and it stayed." Walter repeated the names silently, surprised by how naturally they seemed to fit. Nia, Milo. Once named, they no longer felt like an encounter. They felt like history. What happened next unsettled Walter more than the reunion itself. Nia lowered her head slightly, not in threat, but in acceptance, and let Milo remain with him. A wild mother had every reason to call her calf back, to place distance between them and the two men at the water point. Instead, she stood a few yards away, calm and alert, as if granting permission that did not belong to any human being to request. Lena arrived 20 minutes later in the station truck, summoned by a clipped message Noah had forced through on the radio before his hand started shaking too badly to hold it steady. She stepped out expecting trouble and stopped dead when she saw Walter standing in plain view, Milo nosing curiously at the buttons on his shirt, while Nia watched from under an acacia's thin shade. For once, Lena had nothing ready to say. She recovered quickly, but Walter saw the change in her face. Not surrender, not sentimentality, something more disciplined than either. She took out her field notebook and began writing at once, asking Noah for times, distances, sequence. How long since visual contact? Whether the approach had been initiated by calf or matriarch? Whether any food had been offered? Walter answered in a low voice, without taking his eyes off Milo, who had discovered the notebook in his hand and seemed deeply offended by paper that refused to smell interesting. Milo's excitement had a kind of innocence that made Walter unexpectedly emotional. She bumped his forearm, then the side of his hip, then paused to study the watch strapped to his wrist, as though trying to understand why this particular human carried small ticking things everywhere. Walter felt something rise in his chest so quickly, it caught him off guard. He had not realized how badly he needed to be remembered by something without words. Nia moved then, and every muscle in Noah's body tensed, but the mother only came close enough to touch Milo's shoulder with the tip of her trunk, a brief correction that quieted the calf at once. It was the same kind of touch Walter had seen mothers use in grocery stores and church parking lots back home. Firm, familiar, impossible to misunderstand. Milo settled beside him after that, no longer bouncing with energy, just standing close as if proximity itself were enough. Lena kept watching the mother. "This is not random," she said finally, more to the page than to the men. "She's choosing this." There was no excitement in her tone, only the careful gravity of a scientist recognizing a pattern she had not expected to find. She noted Nia's distance, posture, vocalizations, and the absence of stress signals that would normally accompany such close tolerance. Walter knew enough by then to understand that Lena was not speaking lightly. When the sun climbed higher, Nia gave a low rumble that changed the entire atmosphere. Milo answered immediately and stepped away from Walter with visible reluctance, following her mother toward the trees. Halfway there, the calf turned back and lifted her trunk once more. A small gesture, almost a question. Walter raised his hand in return, without thinking. Nia watched the exchange, then continued walking, unhurried, as if certain now that leaving did not mean losing. They were gone within minutes, absorbed back into the open country as completely as if they had never been there. The water point looked ordinary again. Birds returned. Insects resumed their thin electric hum. Noah let out a long breath and laughed under it, the sound shaky with leftover adrenaline. Lena closed her notebook more carefully than usual. Walter stood with the useless little pencil in his hand and felt the morning rearrange the rest of his life. On the drive back to the station, no one talked much. Dust trailed behind the truck in pale ribbons. Walter looked out at the broad sweep of grassland and understood with quiet certainty that he was not ready to leave Kenya. The feeling was not reckless. It was steadier than that. He had come here thinking he needed to outrun grief. Instead, something in this land, and in those two elephants moving through it, had begun teaching him how to stay still inside it. Walter Boone's return ticket sat folded inside the front pocket of his duffel bag for nearly a week, before he finally took it out and stared at it long enough to admit what had already changed. It was no longer a plan. It was evidence of a life that had begun to loosen its grip on him. Outside the station office, the afternoon wind rattled the dry seed pods in the thorn trees while he held the paper between both hands like something fragile. He found Lena near the supply shed, checking a cracked solar panel with the kind of focus that made interruption feel impolite. Walter waited until she looked up. "If I stayed a little longer," he said, almost apologetically, "would I be more help than trouble?" Lena studied him for a moment, reading the question beneath the question. Then she wiped her hands on her pants and said, "That depends. Can you repair a generator choke without swearing at it?" Walter surprised himself by laughing. It was not a large sound, but it came from somewhere he had not heard in a while. "I can swear very respectfully," he said. Lena nodded once, as if that settled the matter. "Then stay a little longer." She said it plainly, without ceremony. But something in her tone carried a permission deeper than logistics. Not just stay at the station. Stay in the world. Stay in this chapter of his own life long enough to see what it might become. Rachel took the news better than he expected. When he called that evening, she was quiet at first, then asked him questions in the careful, practical order she always used when she was trying not to sound emotional. Where would he sleep? Was the place safe? Was there medical help nearby? Walter answered each one as honestly as he could. At the end, she let out a breath and said, "Mom would have loved this. She would have pretended to worry, but she would have loved it." The next morning, Walter moved his things from the guest lodge to the spare room at the station, a narrow space with a metal bed, a wash basin, and one screened window that looked toward the open corridor where animals sometimes passed at dawn. Noah called it an upgrade because the roof only leaked in 2 known places. Walter set Elaine's journal in the bedside drawer, hung his one good shirt on a nail, and placed his watch tools in a careful row on the small desk, as if arranging a life into temporary order. What began as a few extra days turned useful almost immediately. A broken latch on the medicine cabinet, a station clock that lost 7 minutes every afternoon because its warped backing shifted in the heat, a hand pump near the water drum that needed disassembling and cleaning. Walter moved through each task with the same patience he had once given to old mechanisms in Ohio, and the staff began to seek him out with things tucked in their palms and hopeful expressions they tried to hide. Noah, who possessed the restless energy of a younger brother and the instincts of someone who had grown up listening closely to danger, attached himself to Walter without embarrassment. He wanted stories about snow, high school football games, American diners, and whether all old men in Ohio really drank black coffee that tasted like burned wood. In return, he taught Walter how to read spoor, how to tell fresh elephant sign from yesterday's passage, and how to watch birds for clues about what larger animals might be moving nearby. Lena remained more guarded, but the sharpness in her manner had softened into respect. She still wrote everything down. She still corrected Noah when he leapt too quickly toward meaning. But now and then, Walter caught her watching him repair, something with an expression that suggested she understood the quiet dignity of practiced hands. One evening she admitted, while sorting field reports by lantern light, that people who came through the station often wanted to feel inspired more than they wanted to be useful. "You," she said, "appear to have made the rarer choice." The days settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and deeply familiar. Early tea, patrol checks, notes at the water point, repairs in the heat-thick middle hours when the insects whined and the world seemed to shimmer at the edges. Then dusk, when the station slowed and voices lowered and the first stars came out over the plain with an intimacy Walter had never known beneath American streetlights. He found that purpose, once returned, did not arrive with fanfare. It arrived disguised as routine, and threaded through that new routine, like a note too low to miss once you had heard it, were Nia and Milo. Not every day, not predictably, but often, enough that Walter stopped treating each appearance as an impossibility and began receiving them instead as part of the living pattern of the place. Sometimes he would look up from a toolbox or a notebook and find them at a distance, moving across the grass with that slow, ancient certainty elephants carried in their bodies. Sometimes Milo would edge nearer while Nia watched. It was the watching that stayed with him. Nia never behaved like an animal who had forgotten the terms of the world. She remained wild in every way that mattered, self-possessed, intelligent, impossible to claim. Yet whenever Milo drifted toward Walter, Nia allowed it with an attentiveness that felt almost deliberate. Once, when the calf reached too eagerly for a cloth sack of oranges and nearly knocked over a bucket, Nia corrected her with a low rumble and one quick touch to the shoulder. Milo settled at once. Lena saw it too. "She's moderating the interaction," she said one afternoon, not taking her eyes off the pair. "Not tolerating it, guiding it." Walter glanced at her. "You make that sound like a lesson." Lena closed her notebook softly. "Maybe it is." She did not elaborate, and he did not ask. But the idea stayed with him long after the elephants had moved off into the amber grass, Milo pausing once to look back, as if memorizing where he had left him. That night, Walter sat outside the spare room with Elaine's journal open on his knee and the station quiet around him. He did not write much. He had never been a man of many written words. But he added one line beneath the page that had sent him across an ocean. "You were right. Life still moves." He looked up after that and listened to the dark. Far off, somewhere beyond the thorn fence and the sleeping generator, a deep elephant rumble rolled through the night like distant weather. He did not know then how far this new life would carry him, or what price would eventually come with loving a place and being loved back by it. He only knew that when he touched the left side of his chest, he no longer felt emptiness there alone. Something else had joined it, something tender, unfinished, and alive. By the time he finally went inside, the return ticket was no longer in his duffel bag. He had left it on the desk, tucked inside the journal, like a version of himself he no longer needed. If this story touched your heart, leave a 1 in the comments. If you believe kindness is never forgotten, leave a 0. And if this moment stayed with you, tell us where you're watching from. We read every comment, and your words help keep these stories alive. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications, because the next story might be even more powerful than this one. Stay with us, and we'll see you in the next unforgettable story.